Okay. I want to be honest with you about something before I go anywhere else with this reading. When I saw the title, my first instinct was to match its energy. Real danger, shocking confession, someone with bad intentions. And I sat with that for a minute, and I want to be careful because I think there's something real here worth talking about, but I also don't want to amplify fear that isn't actually warranted or turn a genuine situation into something more dramatic than it needs to be. So let me start by saying this. The word danger in readings like this almost never means literal physical danger. And I don't feel that here at all. What I do feel is something more nuanced and honestly more interesting than a simple villain and victim story. Let me try to describe it properly. The first thing that's coming through is someone talking about you and not casually. This is someone who has said something to someone else about you specifically that they probably didn't intend to get back to you, something they considered private, maybe something they considered safe to say precisely because they didn't think it would travel. But things have a way of traveling, especially things said with strong emotion behind them. Strong emotion gives words a kind of velocity. They don't stay where they were put. And what's moving in your direction right now, I think, is some version of what this person actually said or what they actually feel. Both of which I sense are more significant than anything they've ever said to your face. Give me a second here because I want to understand the quality of what was said, not just the fact of it. Um, okay, here's what I'm picking up, and I want to be precise about this. What was confessed, whatever form it took, wasn't malicious. I know the title has a devil emoji and language about danger, and I'm not going to pretend that framing isn't there. But when I actually sit with the energy, what I find underneath it is more vulnerable than threatening, more raw than dangerous. What I think happened is that this person said something to someone they trusted that revealed how much you matter to them, how much space you take up in their thinking, how much your presence or your absence or some specific thing you did has affected them in a way they haven't been able to fully process on their own. And confession is the right word, actually, because confessions aren't always about wrongdoing. Sometimes a confession is just the thing you finally say out loud to another person because carrying it privately has become too heavy, because you need to hear yourself say it to someone else in order to understand what it actually is. I think that's closer to what happened here. Someone needed to say something about you out loud, and they said it, and now it's out there in a way they probably didn't fully account for. I want to talk about who this person is because I think that matters. What I'm sensing is someone who has a relationship with you that has, on the surface, a certain defined shape, a role they occupy in your life, a way you interact, a kind of understood dynamic. And within that defined shape, they've been managing something that doesn't quite fit the shape, a feeling or a set of feelings that exceeds the container of how your relationship has been structured. I keep getting this image of water in a cup that's too small for the amount of water that keeps being poured into it. At some point, it just starts to overflow. Not because anyone poured too quickly, just because the cup ran out of room. That's what the confession is: overflow. Something that finally exceeded the capacity of this person to keep it contained within the boundaries of how things have been between you. Has there been someone in your life recently who has been behaving in ways that felt slightly out of proportion to how you'd expect them to behave? Someone whose reactions to you or to things involving you have had a quality of intensity that didn't quite match the surface of what was happening? Tell me in the comments, because I think you probably already have a sense of who this is, even if you haven't let yourself fully follow that instinct. Now I want to address the real danger framing, because I don't want to just dismiss it. I think it's pointing at something, even if the framing is more dramatic than the underlying reality. The danger, I think, is the danger of this information reaching you in a distorted form, of the actual confession, whatever it genuinely was, being filtered through someone else's telling of it, someone else's interpretation of it before it gets to you. And distorted information is its own kind of problem because it can produce reactions that aren't quite calibrated to what actually happened. If you hear a version of this that makes the person sound more threatening or more calculating or more problematic than they actually are, and you react to that version, you might end up responding to something that isn't quite real. That's where the danger actually lives, not in what was said. I don't think what was said is dangerous in the literal sense, but in how it gets to you and whether what reaches you resembles what actually was. I think it's worth holding that lightly. If information reaches you about what this person said, try to stay curious about it before you decide how to feel. Ask yourself whether the version you're hearing sounds like a complete picture or whether it might have been edited in transit, whether intentionally or just through the natural distortion that happens when things pass from person to person. Let me talk about the love dimension of this because it's in the title and I don't think it's incidental. What I'm sensing underneath all of the drama of the framing is actually something quite tender. A person who has feelings for you that they haven't known what to do with, feelings that have been building maybe for longer than you'd guess. And those feelings, when they finally came out in the imperfect, slightly messy way that feelings often do when they've been held in too long. They didn't come out to you directly. And I think that's worth noting. The fact that this went to someone else first rather than to you tells you something about how much they're struggling with it. If they were confident, if they knew what they wanted to do about it, they probably would have found a way to address it with you, even awkwardly, even imperfectly. The fact that it went sideways, that it came out in a confession to someone else rather than a conversation with you, suggests someone who is genuinely overwhelmed by what they feel, not in control of it, not managing it well, just carrying something that got too heavy. I think there's something almost touching about that, even if it's creating complexity for you right now. I want to talk about what you should actually do with this information or with the approach of this information, because I think that's the most practically useful part of this whole reading. The first thing I'd say is don't rush to respond. If and when this reaches you, give yourself some time to actually sit with it before you react, whether in conversation with the person who told you or with the person the confession was about. Reactions made quickly from a place of surprise or heightened emotion tend to be the ones you wish you'd thought through more carefully. The second thing is try to get to the primary source if you can. If this reaches you filtered through someone else's account of what was said, I'd be careful about treating that account as definitive. The actual words, the actual context, the actual tone in which things were said, those can be very different from a secondhand summary, especially if the person summarizing has their own investment in how you react. And the third thing, which I think is actually the most important, try to extend some compassion even before you fully understand what's happening. Not because anyone is necessarily owed your compassion automatically, but because I think when you get closer to the actual source of this, what you're going to find is someone who is genuinely struggling, not someone who intended to cause harm, someone who is dealing imperfectly with something they didn't quite know how to handle. I want to say something about your own role in all of this because I don't think this is happening entirely separate from you. What I'm picking up is that something about how you've been recently, some quality you've been bringing to this connection, has intensified whatever this person is feeling, not deliberately, not as a strategy, just something in how you've been showing up has made it harder for them to maintain whatever equilibrium they'd been relying on to keep things manageable. Maybe you've been warmer than usual recently. Maybe something happened that gave them a glimpse of you in a way that exceeded what they were prepared for. Maybe just the accumulation of time, of interactions, of their own private experience of caring about you finally tipped something over an edge it had been approaching for a while. I think you've had more effect on this person than you've been fully aware of. And I think part of what's unfolding now is a kind of reckoning with that. On their end, certainly, but also perhaps on yours. I want to close with something that I think is actually the heart of this reading. Stripped of all the dramatic framing, someone who cares about you said something honest about it in a space where they thought they were safe, and that honesty is now finding its way toward you. That's it, really. Underneath the shocking secret and the danger language and the devil emoji. A person feeling something real about you, finally letting it out somewhere, even if the somewhere wasn't you, even if the timing and the manner weren't quite right. And I think what comes next for you is a choice about how to receive that, not as a threat, even though it arrived in threatening sounding packaging, not as a scandal to be managed or a danger to be avoided, more like an invitation, maybe an imperfect and slightly clumsy invitation, but an invitation nonetheless to have something more honest between you and this person than what's existed up until now. Whether you take that invitation is, of course, yours to decide. And there's nothing wrong with needing time before you decide, but I'd encourage you as you sit with this to let the real texture of it come through rather than the dramatic version of it. Because the real texture, I think, is less frightening and more meaningful than the framing would suggest. Something real was said about you by someone for whom you matter more than you knew. That's not danger. That's just someone finally telling the truth.